Think about the civil rights movement. One name dominates the conversation: Martin Luther King Jr. He's the one who's remembered the most, unlike another man. This other man was fighting the same fight, in the same era, for the same people. A man just as influential, just as revolutionary, but more dangerous to the system than King. His name was Malcolm X, and today, most people barely know who he was, especially outside the United States. So the question is, why is it like that? And the answer to that question lies into the way they spread their message. Martin Luther King Jr. preached non-violence. I'm sure you know of his iconic speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where he said he dreamed of a day when black and white children would hold hands. He talked about turning the other cheek, about peaceful protest, about integration. His message was acceptable for white America because it asked for inclusion within the existing system, not the destruction of it. And because of that, King became the face that everyone could celebrate, or you could say, the acceptable revolutionary. But you see, Malcolm X was different. He wasn't interested in begging for a seat at the table, but instead, he wanted to build his own table. Malcolm believed in self-defense, not passive resistance. He said black people should protect themselves by any means necessary. He didn't talk about dreams, he talked about reality. The brutal, bloody reality of what white supremacy had done to black people in America. And he wasn't asking white America for permission to be free. He was demanding it, while actively creating a sense of black pride. But why was he like that? Why did he prefer this brutal way to look at things instead of the positive one of Martin Luther King? It's actually because of what happened in his life in the early years of it. First of all, his name wasn't always Malcolm X, but it was Malcolm Little. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a supporter of Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist who believed African Americans should return to Africa. Earl preached controversial sermons that made him a target. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father died. The official story said he was hit by a streetcar, but Malcolm believed his father was murdered by white supremacists, and the authorities did nothing about it. Malcolm wanted to become a lawyer. He was smart, driven, even had the grades. Believe me, he was an excellent student. But his teacher told him to be realistic, because being a lawyer wasn't a job for a black person. That moment killed something in young Malcolm. It was like something clicked into him, and he realized that if he was going to rise and become important, he was going to do it in a different way than being a lawyer. By 18, Malcolm was living in Harlem, deep in the underworld. Gambling, drug dealing, robbery, pimping. He became known as Detroit Red, a street hustler surviving in a world that had already decided he had no future. But prison changed everything. In 1946, Malcolm was sentenced to 8 to 10 years for burglary. Behind bars, he met a man who introduced him to an organization named the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. The nation taught that white people were devils, that black people were the original humans, and that Islam was the path to black liberation. Malcolm devoured these teachings. He was even asked to change his name and stop using the name of a slave. And so, when he was released in 1952, he wasn't Malcolm Little anymore. He was Malcolm X. The X represented the African name that had been stolen from his ancestors during slavery. Malcolm rose quickly within the Nation of Islam. By the late 1950s, he had become their leading spokesman. He spoke a language that resonated with poor black people in the inner cities. People who felt abandoned by the civil rights movement's focus on integration and non-violence. In his famous Message to the Grassroots speech, Malcolm drew a clear line between what he called the Black Revolution and the Negro Revolution. He said real revolutions were bloody. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, all of them involved land and bloodshed. But the civil rights movement was locking arms with the very people who were oppressing them. Malcolm believed that wasn't the way to solve things. Malcolm also talked about house slaves versus field slaves, and this difference is important to understand Malcolm's point of view. The house slave lived in his master's house, ate his master's food, wore his master's clothes. He loved his master. But the field slave hated his master. Malcolm said modern black people who loved living and working around white people were the new house slaves. The masses who wanted true liberation were the field slaves, and Malcolm proudly called himself a field slave. This message was radical and dangerous, and it connected with people that King's message couldn't reach. But Malcolm's journey didn't stop there. In 1964, he left the Nation of Islam because he learned that Elijah Muhammad had fathered children with multiple young secretaries. Malcolm left the organization. He founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated and then the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and he made a pilgrimage to Mecca. That trip changed him. In Mecca, Malcolm saw Muslims of all races praying together as equals, and he also saw white Muslims who treated him as a brother. For the first time, Malcolm realized that maybe the problem wasn't white people as a race, but racism as a system. He began to evolve beyond the strict black nationalism of the Nation of Islam toward a broader vision of human rights. Malcolm also traveled to the Middle East and Africa, and in September 1964, he visited Gaza. He toured Palestinian refugee camps, seeing everything that was going on over there, and he was shocked. Malcolm connected the struggle of Palestinians to the struggle of black Americans. He condemned Israel's treatment of Palestinians and called Zionism a form of colonialism. But it didn't stop there. He met with leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He understood that liberation wasn't just a local fight, it was global. And this evolution made Malcolm even more dangerous, because now he didn't stop at the United States, but he was looking to change the whole world. Unfortunately, he could never do that. Malcolm knew he was a marked man. He said it openly in interviews. The Nation of Islam wanted him dead for leaving. On February 14, 1965, Malcolm's house was firebombed and him and his family almost died. The FBI had been surveilling him for years. He had made too many enemies. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X stood on stage at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, preparing for a speech, when 3 men rushed to the stage with guns. Malcolm was shot multiple times. He died at 39 years old. His pregnant wife and his daughters watched from the front row. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of his murder, but still to this day, there are so many doubts regarding what actually happened during his assassination. It's just another of the many doubts of history. What's sad is that this man's legacy is partly forgotten, despite the fact he had done so much for the black community. So the question is, why is that? And as I told you at the start, it's because he was too radical for white America. But it's exactly because of this that he was able to make such big impact. If Malcolm X didn't exist, Martin Luther King would have never accomplished as much as he did, because King would have been the one considered radical by white America. But since Malcolm X pushed everything further, King was viewed as the reasonable and safe option. On top of that, Malcolm X motivated the portion of audience King couldn't reach, the field slaves. The system prefers heroes who ask politely. Malcolm demanded. But even if history has forgotten him, his legacy certainly lived on. Malcolm taught black people that they didn't need white approval to be free. After Malcolm died, King wrote about him. Malcolm X was clearly a product of the hate and violence invested in the Negro's blighted existence in this nation. The murder of Malcolm X deprives the world of a potentially great leader. The truth is, Malcolm X was never really forgotten. He was just never fully remembered by the people in power. Because to truly remember Malcolm would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth he spent his life speaking. That America's problems can't be solved by asking nicely. That the system wasn't designed to be reformed. That real freedom requires real power. And that's a message that still scares the establishment today. Malcolm X fought the system and died for it, but his legacy lives on in every person who refuses to settle for crumbs when they deserve the whole meal. And speaking of a person that fought the system and lost, I've made a video about John F. Kennedy. Make sure to watch it.